My name is Asha Wilkerson, and I am an attorney in California practicing in the San Francisco Bay Area. I focus specifically on business law and employment law, but as it relates to churches and nonprofit organizations. But before I begin, I must give a special thank you to the Pacific School of Religion and the TEL program. Thank you, Lori, for inviting me here, and also thank you, Pastor Janice, for inviting me here as well. I'm so excited about this webinar today, and thank you, both of you, for inviting me and believing in me and working with me to make it happen. Thank you, all of you who are participating. Without your participation, we wouldn't be here either. So today, we are going to be talking about faith and resistance, legal liability for congregational activism. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question box at any time. I will do my best to get through the first half of the presentation, answer as many questions as I can, and then move on to the second half so that the answers are still relevant. I'm going to share my screen with you now for my PowerPoint presentation. That's titled Faith and Resistance, Legal Responsibility for Congregational Activism. So again, just follow along with me. Today we're going to cover liability in two different areas: on-site liability, so within the four walls of your church, and then off-site liability, which is where the activism or the protests might really take place. And then I'll leave you with some best practices so you can move forward protecting your congregation, but then also fighting the good fight as well. Now, all of you are tuned in today because you know how important it is, but just in case you need a little bit more convincing, I'm going to give you another very good reason about why it's important to understand what the liability is or could be for your church or religious organization. If you are involved, either as an individual or as an organization, in a lawsuit, oftentimes there are financial judgments that are attached to the lawsuit for the party that prevails. Meaning, if you win the lawsuit and there's some kind of economic harm that occurs, the person you have just prevailed over in the lawsuit owes you money. Well, as a church or a faith-based organization or an individual, just in general, you don't want to owe people money. So it's important to take the time to understand where the liability could be so that you don't have to pay or deal with any financial judgments. And depending on the size of your organization, a $5,000 judgment might be 1 month's operating expenses, or it might be a tenth of your operating expenses. But again, it goes back to being good stewards over what we're given. So why give out money when we don't have to and when we can take steps to prevent it? Secondly, just on the moral grounds, as a faith-based organization, people look up to you. People in your congregation look up to you. People in the community look up to you. And it is very, very easy to undermine your message when you haven't taken all the steps to make sure that you are engaging properly with the world and the people around you. So let's move forward so I can show you a little bit more about how to protect your church from any possible liability issues. Protecting your church within the four walls. Here we go. So negligence. Everyone's heard about negligence. Negligence is the failure to behave with the level of care that someone of ordinary prudence would have exercised under the same circumstances. So negligence is not an intentional act. Most times we think of it as an accident, but if you should have done better or should have known better, then that can amount to negligence in the civil liability context. Specifically, as I'm going to be talking to you guys today, we're going to cover two areas: premises liability, what happens on your property, and then also liability for the agents of your organization. As the owner or operator of a premises, you are under the duty to exercise ordinary care, control, and management of the premises to avoid any unreasonable risk of harm to individuals. So what does that mean? That means when you invite people, whether they're congregation members, whether they're community members, guest speakers, when people come onto your property, you are responsible for their safety and well-being once they step onto your property. So, if you have a piece of carpet that seam is just starting to come up, and it happens, carpet can be expensive to replace, but if it's in a place that's highly trafficked, If it's been there for a long time and somebody catches their shoe or their toe in the carpet and falls and hurts themselves, your organization, church or not, could be responsible for that person's injury if you did not exercise the expected care, prudence, and attention to prevent that harm from happening. You are also at times liable for the actions of your invitees on your property. So if you invite people to the property and let's say two people get into a heated argument and push comes to shove, you may have to answer for the interactions between these two people if one person was harmed. Now there's a few steps in between there. It depends on how the leaders of the organization respond to the incident, but if you fail to address it and to handle it, then that could lead to some potential liability. So now that we've got negligence covered, I'm going to tell you how it applies in the different aspects or areas that you engage in as a faith-based organization. So in religious services, you invite people onto your property all the time, Sundays, Saturdays, Wednesday Bible study, bingo night on Mondays, whatever activity you do to invite people onto your premises, you need to be thinking about the liability in that area. As it comes to rallies and getting people together behind a certain issue, you need to think about how many people can we fit in this one room, what kind of topics are we talking about, is tension going to be high, do we have enough water for people, do we have enough exits for people, do we have enough organization and security or leaders to help keep people safe in this area. You also want to think about it in town hall meetings, same idea. Basically, anytime you invite people onto your property, then you have to be thinking about their safety and well-being as you engage with them on your property. Now, here's a big question from a lot of people. What can we say as leaders? What can we say from the pulpit? What can I say as the pastor? Well, everyone's heard of the free speech clause to the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees everybody the freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition. But there are, however, exceptions to free speech. Obscenity, child pornography, and fighting words or true threats are never protected under free speech. So this is where it gets interesting with the line, and not that any of you guys, of course, are inciting violence using fighting words or using threats, but you've seen it in public, you've seen it on TV, where people are claiming, hey, this is my right to say this about X group of people or about this group over there. Well, you can have whatever opinion that you want. You can be religious based or not. You can say it in most cases wherever you want to say it, but you cannot incite harm to people. You cannot incite violence. You cannot incite people to break the law. That kind of speech is not protected under the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Additionally, when we're speaking in front of groups of people, we definitely want to be aware of defamation. So defamation is uttering words that are not true about an individual, but it has to cause harm to them. So I get questions all the time about, well, somebody was gossiping about me, or someone was, they said something that just wasn't true. If it's not published and if there isn't any real harm that's quantifiable to that, that doesn't amount to defamation. But in times when we are talking about activism, talking about protests, and we are speaking out against injustice, it's important to make sure that the facts that we say are true, especially if we're talking about other people, because there is a possibility that we could be responsible if we are telling things that aren't true, whether we realize that they are untrue or not. Now, there's a difference also between what we believe and a call to action. So in your church or institution or in your home or in a public space, you can say whatever your belief is. So you can say, I believe, as a religious base, that everybody needs to wear purple, and people who don't wear purple aren't good people. You can say that. But what you cannot say is, I believe everyone should wear purple, and if you don't wear purple, then you need to be hit. That's not okay, because that's using fighting words and that's inciting people to violence. So when you are making your call to action, from the pulpit or from a meeting, whether you're wearing a collar or not. You need to be very clear about what it is that we believe and also what the call to action is, so that you are careful not to cause people to harm others in the name of a good cause. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about liability in the street, so outside of the four walls of your church or organization. Another area of liability that we need to talk about is agents of the church. So agents of your organization can be employees, they can be volunteers, board members. They are basically anyone who holds themselves out as being a representative of your church. Now there's a second piece of it. The church also has to approve their actions as agents or as representatives of the church. But anybody who pretty much holds themselves out and holds a position within the church or as a volunteer or a board member can have or can bind the organization legally to different items or to different actions. So as a board, board members have the ability to sign contracts depending on how your bylaws are set up. Because the board member has signed a contract, now the church is bound to that contract because the board member is an agent of the organization. Same thing with counseling, and this is probably a whole nother webinar at a different point, but when you are engaged in pastoral counseling, you need to be very clear about the parameters and the scope of your counseling. So there are a number of ways to do pastoral counseling. It's all Bible-based, but if someone comes to you and says, you know, I'm feeling depressed, I don't think I want to be here anymore, I have a plan to go home and harm myself, unless you are a licensed mental health care provider, so a social worker, a counselor, psychologist, then you need to escalate that threat that person has made. You need to shift that out to either call 911 or take them to a hospital or report it to somebody who is able to deal with that kind of harm. So you can't just keep it within the walls. And I know that there is kind of I think we're getting better in churches in terms of being open to counseling, but do know that there's very real possibility that if someone says, I plan to harm myself or others, and you don't take the proper steps to report that to a licensed professional, there may be some liability if you are counseling them on behalf of your church. You also, again, need to be careful about preaching. When you make statements, you know, as the representative of your organization, you are then binding your organization to those statements. So it's going back again to defamation, making sure that the statements that you are saying are true, and also staying within the realm of the free speech rights that we all have. So, yep, we already talked about defamation, lobbying, and calls to action. So making sure that the individuals who are working on behalf of the church understand these three areas so that they are acting prudently and within the confines of the law, within the bounds of the law, so that the church doesn't then later have to take on any legal liability behind its leaders. So here are some ways that I think are very helpful for protecting your organization from liability. Train your employees, your volunteers, and your board members on liability issues in general. Everybody who's in a leadership position at the church should understand, hey, you know, if it's raining on Sunday and people are coming in, if you see water on the ground, please take it upon yourself to wipe it up. Because if you don't and someone comes in and slips down, then now that's an issue for the church that could have been avoided if somebody or a group of people knew that they were empowered to clean up that kind of a mess. Maintain the premises in good condition. Stay up on the upkeep. Maintain maintenance logs. When you need to do, you know, regular checks, regular maintenance, just make sure that it happens so that there aren't any defects that you're not aware of on the property. If you are aware of any defects, then, you know, correct them as soon as you know about them. Also train your employees and volunteers and board members on free speech rights. What does it mean? What can you say? What can you not say? And then lastly, create a relationship with an attorney so you can ask questions on a regular basis. And all of this, again, goes into the activism portion, not directly standing up in front of people or lobbying at the Capitol. We'll talk about that later. But this comes when you are gathering your community within your church, and you are empowering them and asking them to step up, but you still have to protect them when they come onto your property. All right, let me see if I can answer some quick questions. Oh. There we go. Okay. The question is related to inciting people to break the law. What about civil disobedience? Some religious groups have a history of engaging in civil disobedience to bring about change. Can a pastor advocate for civil disobedience? That is an excellent question, and I promise I will get to that in the second half. I actually have a whole slide for civil disobedience. So that was the only question for the first half, so we are going to move right into the second half. Go ahead and share my screen again. Getting ahead of myself. All right, so now we're going to talk about taking it to the streets, how to protect your church outside of its four walls. So again, our areas of concern have to do with negligence, protesting, criminal penalties, and then what is the reason why we need to worry about this as nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations. So for negligence, you need to think about how are you transporting people to your protests. And not even just in protests, but if you were taking the youth group on a field trip or if you're going to a concert, you need to think about the liability around transportation. You need to have insurance for the vehicle. The driver of the vehicle needs to be on the insurance policy. You need to maintain the vehicles in good condition. And you need to think about where you are taking people and what kind of an environment is it? Is it one that's high with tension? Is there a potential for harm or for violence? Is it, safe and calm? You just need to be aware of those things so that you can talk to the people who are going with you about it, and so that you can also adequately protect your organization from any kind of liability. So the things that can happen when you take people off of your premises are auto accidents. If people or individuals happen to cause damage to property when they get out there and when they protest, especially if you've brought them to the group. So you said, hey, you know what, we're going to the Capitol. We don't believe in this law. This law just needs to change. So we're going to make our presence known at the Capitol. So, emotions rise up. People say things back and forth to each other. Tension builds. And you've seen it on TV. Not that that's an accurate representation of all of the protests, but people get upset. They get frustrated. They throw things. They break things. If there is anybody in your organization that has engaged in that kind of violent or destructive activity, if they are there in your church van, wearing your church t-shirt, acting on behalf of your church because you have called them to do that, then not to break the law, but you have called them to be there and to protest, you need to be ready for the potential consequences that may come their way from engaging in that type of activity. Other times, physical injury occurs to members that you've brought with your group, or sometimes harm occurs to people who are outside of your group, but it was caused by people inside your group. That's definitely an area of liability. When people start asking questions, they go, how did you get here? Oh, I came with my church. Oh, what's your church's name? Oh, well, how did you physically arrive? Well, we all came in the church van or the church bus, so we caravan together. Now the church or the organization is all tied into that person being there and their presence. So we'll talk about educating people later about what the law is, but it's important to do that. And again, it's important to make sure that you know what you are asking people to do so you can be ready for the potential areas of liability as they might pop up. Occasionally it happens where people are protesting or they're at a concert, somebody falls down, gets hurt, gets trampled. Sometimes if it's hot outside, people have medical complications. You need to think about that. That may cause physical harm or possibly even death. It has happened before, and of course we would do everything that we could to avoid that, but it's something that you need to think about. There is also a criminal component to this. Is if there are people in an organization that have gotten together and someone says, you know what, the leaders aren't listening. I think we should break the windows of this business so they'll hear us. Person number 2 says, you know what, you're right. Person number 3 says, I'll be the lookout. What have they just done? They have just created a criminal conspiracy to break the law. Conspiracy is an agreement between 2 or more people to commit a crime. Now, they may not at the time realize that they are engaging in this conspiracy, but once they agree, that's exactly what they've done. Now, if they are at the site because they are members of your organization or because you called them and said, hey, we need to take it to the streets, we need to protest, that could reflect upon your organization. If not for criminal responsibility, then certainly it will affect the reputation of your organization. And so you want to make sure that you talk to people who are out there because you've asked them to be out there. Talk to them about how to behave and what the laws are and what the potential consequences are for those kinds of activities. So now we're going to get into protests, which comes from the freedom to assemble, also under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, in America, we have this great opportunity to protest. Not every other country has that opportunity by any means. It, however, here is not a blanket right to protest anywhere at any time and to do anything. The protests are the freedom to assemble is limited, and it's not about the content of what you say, because that's protected under free speech with those exceptions, but is about the conduct. How do you conduct yourself? So it's not what you say, it's the way that you say it. If it causes a serious disruption to activities, especially if you are protesting on the steps of the governor's office building or the steps of the state capitol, if you are or your group of people are disrupting business, there are some potential civil and possibly criminal penalties that might occur because of that. Now, part of the protesting, right, is to disrupt the status quo and to make people uncomfortable and to be heard. And that's fine. That's exactly what it's designed to do. But you also need to be aware of the potential liabilities so that you can make educated choices about when, where, and how to do it. Which leads me to the next point. There's a when, where, and how requirement. You cannot violently protest and expect that it won't be broken up. You have a right to protest. You don't have a right to break the law. Every municipality has its own regulations on time, place, and manner. So most government buildings will have a free speech zone. So City Hall at your local city or your government agency will generally have a free speech zone. And again, it's probably not going to be right in front of the steps to the building because they don't want to disrupt business, but they do have to allow you to be in a place where you can be seen, you can be heard, and you can get your voice out. But there are designated free speech zones. So it's prudent to look up those zones before you go to the Capitol, before you go to the city, go downtown so you can see where those areas are and start a protest or participate in a protest from that point. Each municipality also has its own regulations on permits. You know, most of the times we have to go to the park to get a permit. We have to use the picnic tables with a permit. Same thing. You can get permits for protesting. If you want to march down the streets of downtown, you can apply for a permit and the city should give you permission to do that. Now, the permit is not going to be granted instantly, but there are time requirements. And I want to say that the permit has to be decided upon within 36 hours, but double check with your own local municipality. And that's so that people can march and protest and assemble in a timely manner behind events that happen in our society. So then some injustice happens, we want to protest, you can go and apply for a permit, and within the next 2 days you should be able to get a permit to do that protest. There will be restrictions on it. There will probably be time limits and limits in terms of where you can go, but you do have a permit that will lawfully allow you to assemble and to protest. So again, make sure you check your local municipality to see what the time, place, and manner requirements are and what the permit requirements are as well. So now, going to the question that we had earlier, we're talking about civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is the act of refusing to comply with certain laws as a form of protest. Civil disobedience has been used time and time again throughout history and has been effective. Now, here are a few things that you need to know about civil disobedience, and they have come from the ACLU's Know Your Rights, Free Speech, Protests, and Demonstrations document that they've published. I encourage everyone to go to the ACLU and download that document. It is very enlightening. It clearly explains what a lot of the laws and regulations are and some of the things that you need to cover. So I will start by giving a few of those pointers to you now. If you are going to engage in civil disobedience, carry identification. I have heard time and time again, multiple times, that the police can't ask you for identification. That is false. If you do not have, in most jurisdictions, they require you to carry some kind of ID with a picture ID card. And if you don't have that, then you need to be able to give the police your name and your address. Beyond that, you don't have to give them any other information. So it is a false statement to say, I don't have to tell the police my name or my address. Not true. If you want to get arrested quickly, don't tell the police your name and your address. If you don't want to be arrested and you want to continue engaging in the activities, be prepared either with ID and be prepared to give them your name and your address. Secondly, be aware of the potential consequences. So especially in the Bay Area, there are numerous protests for immigration rights, which is a beautiful thing, but you need to, or I would encourage you, if you are calling people out to protest, to make them aware of the consequences. So one of the potential immigration consequences is that if people are out there, they're breaking the law, and they're undocumented, once they get arrested, the local police department has every right to call U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so ICE, and say, hey, do you have this person on your list as someone who is here unlawfully? When that happens, if the police have arrested you or detained you, they can keep you, and then here comes ICE, and now this individual who was civilly, disobeying the laws is now in deportation proceedings. And usually that will happen because they just didn't know what the potential consequences were. So it's important to educate yourself and your congregation members before you ask people or before you take that steps, just so you know what you're dealing with. Doesn't mean that you won't do it, but the more knowledge you have, then the more informed your decisions can be. Secondly, if you're arrested, your arrest may appear on a background check. Now, everyone is at a different stage in life and has a different position. If you are 18 or 19 years old and you still plan on having a couple of jobs in your future, that arrest may be difficult to explain. It may not be difficult to explain. You might be able to say, hey, I was engaging in, the practice of civil disobedience. We were protesting the curfew law that they enacted in my city, and that's how I got arrested. Now, one employer might say, hey, that's fine. Another employer might say, I don't want anybody with any arrests on their background. So again, that's a personal choice. And whatever choice that you make is perfectly fine, but just know that arrests can show up in background checks even if you're not convicted. So here are some of the penalties, the crimes that you can be charged with for civil disobedience once you're arrested. And now I am in California, so I have provided the California Penal Code citations, but wherever you are across the United States, your state will have similar laws. So you can be arrested for delaying a peace officer, for just being in the way, which of course, delaying is probably quite subjective. You can be arrested for disrupting a public meeting, for rioting and unlawful assembly. So again, if you're gathering in a place and you haven't received a permit, you could be arrested for unlawful assembly. If the police tell you to disperse and you don't, that's another crime in California. If you disturb the peace, you refuse to obey a police officer who's enforcing a vehicle code. So let's say you've parked your car in, let's say you've parked it in the middle of the plaza in front of City Hall and you refuse to obey the police officers ask you to move. That's another penalty. If you're attempting to free a person who's just been arrested, I do not advise that. If someone has been put in handcuffs or in the plastic ties, do not try to free them, because then you will just end up in the handcuffs or the plastic ties right next to them. And if you use threats or threat of force or physical obstruction to interfere with a person's right to reproductive health services or to attend a place of religious worship. So we've all seen the picketers on the corner outside of Planned Parenthood. Those picketers can be arrested for interfering with an individual's right to access the reproductive health facility. Same thing. People can be arrested for preventing you from entering your house of worship. You still have the ability to seek out those services and that space. So if you are interfering with that for anybody, then that is also a crime that you can be arrested for. And we all have, there are infractions, misdemeanors, and felonies. Infraction results in a ticket, and sometimes, there's some money that you have to pay. So sometimes parking violations are infractions, or a speeding ticket might be an infraction. Now, a DUI is considered a misdemeanor, driving under the influence. The reason why that's a misdemeanor is because there is a penalty of jail time not more than 1 year in jail. So misdemeanors are 1 year or less of jail time, and they also carry a fine of $1,000 or less, again in California. Felonies have jail time of 1 year or more, and they have penalties and fines of $1,000 or higher. So your jurisdiction may be a little bit different. The crimes that I've listed here are all going to be quite similar, whether you're in Oregon, Washington, Florida, New York. They're quite similar. They just have a different citation. And they may carry a different sentence too, depending on the code that you're under. So it's very important to know your rights. So I did tell you earlier that you have to tell the police officers your name and your address and or produce ID. Beyond that, you have the right to remain silent. Use it. Please use it. If you are arrested, or if you know anyone who's arrested, tell them to remain silent. We've all seen on Law and Order where the person thinks that they can talk their way out of this arrest. You're not going to be able to. The police officers do this every single day. They are trained to listen, and when people think that they can get out of something, they will tell all on themselves. If you have children, I'm sure, that are able to talk at this point, I'm sure you've heard your children talk themselves into more trouble by thinking that they're getting out of something else, some other area of trouble. But it's the same thing with adults as well. So you have the right to remain silent. Please use it. Don't say anything else. You have the right to legal counsel. Ask for an attorney. So as soon as you've been arrested, say that you want an attorney. Now, every police officer is different. They may try and say, well, if you get an attorney, then I'm not going to be able to let you go. Don't believe it. They're not going to let you go anyway. Get an attorney, because the attorney knows how to talk with the police officers and with the attorneys on the same level, using the same language. And anything that you say can be used against you, and that's exactly what they are trying to do. In California, you have the right to make 3 local phone calls immediately after being booked. So there's the arrest. Let's say you're arrested at a protest, and then you're taken to the jailhouse, and you're fingerprinted, your name is entered into the system. That's when you've been booked. So you have the right to make 3 phone calls right after you've been booked, and being booked, or those 3 phone calls have to occur within 3 hours of actually being arrested. A parent in California gets 2 additional phone calls if they're trying to care for or make custody arrangements for their child or children. If you remain in custody, then a judge will review your case within 24 hours and you must be taken to court within 2 business days. So if you get arrested on a Friday, though, you have to wait until Monday. And again, I just want to stress again, please, please, please do not try and talk yourself out of an arrest. If you've been arrested, remain silent except for asking for an attorney. If you use a telephone, know that all telephone calls are being recorded, whether you're talking to your mother, to your spouse, to your brother. Unless that person is an attorney, that conversation is being recorded and can be used against you to help build their case. So know that, understand that, and then please act accordingly. And now for the last little bit, we were talking about the tax implications. So why does this even matter for churches and for faith-based organizations or nonprofits? Well, under the Internal Revenue Code, Section 501c3, which is what most of us have our tax-exempt status from, those tax-exempt organizations are prevented or have restrictions on lobbying and also candidate electioneering. So if you are lobbying for a particular law or for some change or for new legislation, the amount of lobbying that you do has to be very small compared to the other work that you do as a charitable organization under 501c3 code. So if you are going to be engaging as a faith-based organization in lots of lobbying, so you are, as a faith-based group, we are saying that we want this law to be changed, you need to look at the amount of resources and finances that you're putting into that lobbying, and there is an IRS form that you can use to fill out and say, this is what our activities are, you know, government, just so that you know, we're telling you about it so you can't come back on us and say that we didn't report it to you. Now, more often than not, as a charitable organization, your lobbying activities aren't going to amount to the threshold to the point where you need to report it, but definitely talk to an attorney who is well versed in this area, nonprofit law, so that if you do need to fill out that form or report it, you can do that and not jeopardize your tax exempt status. For candidate electioneering, faith-based organizations, pastors are not able to support or endorse an individual candidate from their position as the leader of the church or the charitable organization. You just can't do it. What you can do is you can invite people into the service or onto the property to say, if there are 3 people who are running for mayor, if one person calls you up and says, hey, can I address your congregation? You happen to like that person, fine. But if you open the door for that one person, you also have to open the door for the other 2 people who are running. So you can't be discriminatory in terms of who you invite onto your property to talk. If you're going to open the door for one person, you must open the door for all of them so they can address your congregation. What you can also do is you can educate your congregation on what the implications are of new laws or legislation. You can say, you know, this is, Prop 56, this is what it means, this is how we think that it would impact our communities. And then, you know, you can answer questions as much as you are informed to your congregation members about that, but you cannot endorse John Doe for mayor or Jane Doe for governor or whatever local offices that people are running for. So let me go back to the questions and see if I have gotten any more questions. No more questions yet. Okay, if you guys have questions, certainly type them in so I can answer them for you, please. All right, now I'm going to share with you some best practices to limit your liability as a church or a faith-based organization. Review your insurance policies. Definitely review your insurance policies. Make sure that they say what you think they say, and make sure that all of the activities that you engage in are covered under them. Most insurance policies review annually, but you know, ministry changes to meet the needs of the people. So let's say in January you started out under this part, but now in June you want to open your doors and run a homeless shelter or work with youth. Then you need to call your insurance company, tell them what the changes are in your business practices, and update the policy to reflect that. and really know what it says. Insurance policies are written specifically so that they can get out of them, right? So know exactly what the terms and conditions are, so you know how to operate, and so that in case something happens, you can be covered under the liability insurance. Educate your congregation, ministry leaders, board members, employees, and volunteers on what these laws are that we've just talked about. So when you're encouraging people to step outside of the four walls of the church and protest, let them know. Have someone, have an attorney come in, or download the ACLU guide, or do some research yourself. Let them know what some of the criminal penalties are. Let them know what some of the civil penalties are, so that people can make an informed decision about how they want to move forward. Beyond that, I think, even if we're not protesting, for those of us who are working in more urban communities where police violence is very real for us, who are working with young men, Black and brown young men for sure, maybe we need to do trainings to help our young people learn how to interact with the police. And that's not to say that, in an ideal world, we shouldn't have to have these special kinds of trainings, but, maybe that's something that we should do as part of our responsibility to help people interact better with other police officers or people of authority, especially when times get tough, because, really part of it is about self-preservation, and we've got to help people survive. The other part of it is about making change, and you want that message to be heard. So whatever training that we need to do so that the message is not lost in the actions, then I encourage all of us to take those steps. I suggest distributing Know Your Rights pamphlets. And again, bringing someone into the space that you are talking to your congregation members or to your community members. Bring someone into that space who is knowledgeable about what your rights are. Again, I hear all the time that you do not have to tell the police your name or give them ID. That is completely false. Yes, you do. And then people believing that they don't have to give that information end up getting arrested, get upset because they're acting based on false and incorrect information. So if we are calling for changes, for people to take a stance, then we also need to do the due diligence on the other side to educate people so that they can make good and correct decisions for themselves. And lastly, consult with an attorney to understand all the potential consequences that may arise and how to protect your church and you as an individual. Again, my practice area stems from the business side of running a church to employment law to covering liability issues as we're just talking about now. You need to know, as the leader of your business, and churches are businesses, so most of the laws that actually apply to for-profit businesses are also going to apply to churches. So you need to know that. I'm on a mission to let churches know that they're actually also businesses. But you need to know the law so you can understand where the potential areas of liability lie. What happens if someone comes onto my property and they have a weapon? How am I supposed to protect my congregation members? How do I protect my employees? What do I need to do to also protect that person who is coming? What is that person's right? What's my right? What's my responsibility? If you have employees, you need to understand the areas of employer liability so that, the employees don't later have a case against you, and so that you can also treat your employees fairly. Understand liability around children. How are you protecting children, and what is your responsibility for working and engaging with children? You need to know that so that you can know the message, so that the message of your organization doesn't get lost, and so that also it can be preserved and that your organization can withstand the test of time. So those are my tips on best practices. I believe we have a few more questions, so I'm going to get started on answering those. Let's see. So here's a question. It says, if people sign a non-violence agreement, does it protect the church if someone becomes violent? I don't know that it would have any real weight in terms of liability, but I do think that getting people on the same page is a great idea. So one of the practices that I would also suggest that you do is before you call people to the streets, maybe have a meeting at the church or at a specific place and cover the ground rules again. Say, hey, we are not about violence. We are about nonviolence. We're about civil disobedience. Here are the rights. Here are the responsibilities. If you are engaging in violence, you are no longer acting on behalf of the church, and I want you to know that. If you get arrested for doing something violent, we're not bailing you out. That's another conversation to have too about civil disobedience. If people are coming to a place and civilly disobeying and they get arrested, but they're there because they're part of the, the movement of the church, who's paying to bail them out of jail should they need to be bailed out? I'm not saying that you as a church have to do it. I'm not saying you don't have to do it, but that is definitely a conversation to have with the board members of the church, leaders of the church, and then also with your members that you're taking with you, just so everybody's on the same page. So if someone signs a nonviolence agreement, it might help because you can use it as evidence later to say, we are about nonviolence. This person was acting beyond the scope of what we called them to do. But depending on some other factors that are in there, it might not have legal weight, but it could be helpful. Next question, can you endorse a particular proposition on the ballot? I would have to do a little bit more research about the specific propositions. I know that you can explain what ballot measures or what the propositions say, what they are, what they mean, and what their impact would have on the community. And I have heard leaders say, vote no for Prop 49, vote yes for Prop 62, but I want to double check and make sure that you can actually do that for ballot measures, but I know that you can't do it for individuals. So if you send me an email or go to churchlawguide.com, and I will also write down that question, and I promise I will write a blog update or send a video blog, quick YouTube video answering your question. So thank you for that question. The next question is it against the law to lie down in the street and to incite others to lie down in the streets? If I say, I feel strongly about this and I would be willing to lie down in the street for it, but I wouldn't do it alone. However, if I know that 1,000 others will lie down with me, I'll lie down in the street. Is that incitement? So that's not incitement to violence. So to recap, the question is, if I lie down in the street as a protest, but I'm not inciting violence, and I ask others to lie down in the street with me, is that against the law? Well, yes, lying down in the middle of the street is against the law, the same way that crossing at a place that other than a crosswalk is considered jaywalking. But if you have 1,000 people that are with you, the police aren't going to be able to arrest 1,000 people. So that would be one of those acts of civil disobedience that could be very impactful, but it doesn't mean that it would be without legal consequences. So it could be, that the police arrest the first few people that they see because that's who they can get their hands on, and now you've stopped traffic and you've caused a major disruption in the city. Now that disruption is unlawful, but are the police going to be able to catch everybody who's done it? No, they're not going to be able to. Is it going to look good, especially if you're protesting for a really good cause? Is it going to look good for the police to arrest people who are lying in the street? No, probably not. Can I guarantee that you won't be arrested or have some kind of civil penalty or violation? I can't do that. But if you get a bunch of people together, I think the chances of facing the criminal consequences are less. Definitely. I think it also depends on which street you're lying down in front of as well. It would depend on time of day. And I also want you to be safe as well. So make sure you have the protection around you if you're going to do that. If you're calling people together, again, you have to worry about if you're lying down in the street. So what if some car decides that they want to go around and one of your members of your congregation gets their leg run over? And now they've broken their leg because we as a church are lying down in the middle of the street. I'm not telling you don't do it. I'm just giving you some information on what some of the potential consequences could be. The next question is, are there special considerations for protests in residential areas? Yes, there are special considerations for protests in residential areas, but that is determined by your municipality, and that would come under the permit requirements. So if you were protesting in a residential area, I would certainly go to the local government office and inquire about a permit. Now, chances are, if it's off the beaten path and it's not really disrupting traffic, the police may not even be aware of it, but as a prudent practice, I would go to the local municipality and see or inquire about the permits. There will probably be fewer restrictions, because if you're in a residential area, you are not then, disrupting government business, and government really cares about government business, not necessarily about, the residential business that's happening. So I would check at the local office for a permit, but you will probably find that the restrictions are much less than if you were protesting on public property. All right, another question is let's see. Okay, so the first half of the question I'm not entirely sure about, but the second half of the question is, what are the consequences for incitement, and what makes something incitement? So incitement, and it's inciting someone to cause harm to others that is not protected by free speech, and in inciting it's harm to others and inciting people to break the law. So the consequences for that goes back to the criminal conspiracy, right? So if you have told someone, I want you to break all of the windows on the government building in protest, and if you've called your congregation together to do that, and now people agree because they've carried out, what you have asked them to do, then you would also be part of that. You would also have criminal liability for that conspiracy right there, even if you never threw a rock or broke a window yourself. So the incitement piece of it is, you can encourage people or call people to take action, but you cannot call people to cause harm to others or to break the law. So that's the piece about incitement. And part of it also depends on how were you exciting people and gathering people up and calling people to take an action. I would be very careful about the words. Just stay away from things that are violent, and stay away from words that might cause people to break the law, which I don't think that should be that challenging, especially if we are talking about carrying out protests in a peaceful way, and using Jesus as our example, right? Jesus was the ultimate nonviolent protester. So if we are following that example and getting the attention of our government agencies in the process of that protest, more likely than not, that we should be okay. But if you are calling people to cause physical harm or to damage other people or property, then depending on how you called them to that action, you could have some responsibility for that as well. Okay, I have a clarifying question. For clarity, is it okay for a pastor to advocate for civil disobedience from the pulpit? In other words, there are not potential legal consequences. In other words, there are not potential legal consequences for the pastor. So anytime that an individual or group of people engage in civil disobedience, there's always the potential for legal consequences, and that comes from being arrested. It does not matter whether you call them to civilly disobey from the pulpit, or if you are standing on the street and call them to civilly disobey. The part about being a pastor is that now the church could have some responsibility for that. But the distinction that I was trying to make is that you can say whatever you want as part of your own personal belief, or your belief that's based on religion, so long as it does not call people to cause harm to other people. So part of that may be, as part of a church, we're going to go out and we're going to sit in the street, to use that as an example. Now, you will more likely than not be liable because you've called people to sit in the street. But if some harm occurs to those individuals who are in the street, now the church may be responsible for that if they are responding to the people, the individuals are responding to a call from the church. Also, again, if somebody gets hurt in that process and, we've publicized, we are rallying at 3 p.m. on Sunday following church service, and the individual, when people get hurt, they want some compensation from somebody. So that individual who gets hurt will probably sue the city. They'll probably sue the driver of the vehicle that ran over their leg, and they're more likely than not going to sue the church, even if they came of their own will and volition, because they feel like, but for the church calling me here, I wouldn't have been out here. So that's the liability piece of it that I think is more critical than just calling someone to civil disobedience from the pulpit. But again, you should be aware of all of the potential consequences that could occur when you call people to action. Next question. So incitement to violence is illegal, but incitement to peaceful disobedience is not. That's correct. So if you are inciting people to break the law or to be violent, that's not protected. Well, it's not protected under free speech. I should say that. But if you are calling people to civilly disobey, that call to civilly disobey is not unlawful, but there still may be some very real consequences for those individuals who are engaging in civil disobedience on the other end if they are arrested or given a citation. And again, I think as the representative and the person who's calling people to action, you need to have a very real conversation with the leaders of your organization to say, hey, we are going to come together as a church at 3 p.m. We are going to civilly disobey. What do we do in case someone is arrested, right? So you want to educate the members who are coming with you who may be arrested. You want to educate them about their rights and their responsibilities. And then you want to have, a conversation about what happens if someone is arrested and they're booked. Are we as a church, because we've called them out there, going to help them through that process? Are we going to hire an attorney for them? Are we going to bail them out if they need to be bailed out of jail? Or is everyone doing it on their own, with their own resources to get themselves out should they end up in jail? Again, there's no right or wrong answer for that, but it is definitely a conversation that you'd want to have so that the message that you are trying to get out there isn't lost behind the legal consequences that you could have to deal with. All right, I think that is the end of the questions so far, and I see Lori back, so I will let you take it away, Lori.
Hi. Well, this is your last chance. If you do have a question, type it in right away, and if we have time, we'll get Asha to answer. But I want to thank you for being part of this, and I really want to thank you, Asha, for sharing your expertise with us. I'm going to put out a shameless plug right now. AshaWilkersonLawOffice.com. Did I get that right?
It is the Wilkerson Law Office. Oh. And actually, I have a specific website for churches. It's called churchlawguide.com, where I have published a book on employment law for church leaders, but also I've written a number of blog posts on various areas of liability that churches need to be aware of. I will be updating those blog posts. I'll be talking more and more about protests, but feel free, please engage with me on that website, engage with me on the Facebook page for Church Law Guide, send me an email. Now the email is long. It's Asha, A-S-H-A, at the Wilkerson, W-I-L-K-E-R-S-O-N, lawoffice.com. Send me an email, go to the website and figure out how to definitely connect with me because I want to answer your questions. And I'm going to share my screen again just quickly because I believe that I wrote it down. So there's the website for you, there's the Twitter handle for you, and I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Great. And I also need to tell you that if you're interested in more webinars, courses, information about community education, you can contact us. We're on the web at psr.edu/TEL. That's the TEL program with one L. And also thanks to the Center for Social and Spiritual Transformation for co-sponsoring this event today.